Welcome back, Funkers, to a special edition of the Funker News Network. Now, every so often, we're going to do a deep dive on a topic or a conflict that has reverberating impact across the globe. This week, we chose to begin a two-part series on the conflict and civil war in Syria. So strap in, strap on, and let's get ready. Let's jump right in. These deep dives are oftentimes going to cover major multi-nation conflicts and fights, and that's why the sponsor of this video is Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP strategy game where you can choose a real country to lead in a modern global war. You can fight up to 128 other players in real time in games that can take up to weeks to complete. There's tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, submarine sandwiches that you can eat while playing the game. And if you're a sweaty nerd like I am, you can actually spend the whole time just picking fights with your neighbors. Or if you're lame, you can just forge alliances the whole time. Now, I'm a huge fan of anything involving strategy, and that's absolutely what's scratching the itch for me on Conflict of Nations. You guys get to click the link in the description to get yourself 13,000 gold and 1 month off of a premium subscription. You can use the same account on mobile as you do on PC. It is cross-compatible. Don't wait. Jump in there. A few weeks ago, we released footage out of two separate incidents involving the deaths of civilians in the city of Iraq, Syria. Now, in both of those incidents, Syrian Arab Army artillery fire was the cause of collateral damage, including the deaths of multiple children. Now, in the comments section of both videos, we saw a rather disturbing trend from people who haven't been following the situation in Syria very close for the past decade. This is a past decade that the civil war there has steadily been going on. Now, as a result, we decided to take a step back from the regular Funker News Network production to put out a video chronicling the situation in Syria over the past 10 years. Now, this is going to be a two-part series, largely because we're really hoping to break this down and take a little bit of time. Now, we understand that sometimes it can be difficult and confusing to keep up with these long-running conflicts. That said, and we'll try to say this up front, the water in Syria is very muddy. And it has been very muddy since mid-2011 when the Assad regime released a bunch of extremist groups from prison to integrate with the Free Syrian Army opposition. This release of extremist groups actually means it's impossible to say one side is the good guys and one side is the bad guys. That said, we're going to do our best to catch you up on the Syrian civil war, and we're going to do our best to stay away from picking one side as the good guys and one side as the bad guys. Let's be perfectly clear on that. We do not support any faction in the Syrian civil war outside of the civilians on the ground who are just trying to live their lives free of bodily harm. On March 15, 2011, protests began in Damascus and Aleppo demanding democratic reforms and the release of political prisoners. This is often referred to as a portion of the Arab Spring. These protests were triggered by the arrest and imprisonment of a small group of teenagers in Daraa who had put some anti-regime graffiti up. Those teenagers were imprisoned and tortured. Now, those protests were met with live ammunition from the Assad regime, which only bolstered the protests throughout Syria. On April 8, 2011, the protests escalated again, calling for the removal of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. By April 22nd, these protests were taking place in over 20 cities, and on April 25th, the regime would once again respond with live ammunition. They conducted a series of deadly military operations against protesters, even using tanks in some instances. Before the situation turned into an armed insurgency in July, over 1,000 civilians and 150 soldiers and policemen had been killed, with thousands more being detained. This is also when portions of the Syrian Arab Army began to defect. On July 29th, 2011, the formation of the Free Syrian Army was announced. This initial group was formed primarily of defected police officers and military service members who formed the first established and organized rebel military force within Syria. On top of this, a lot of the small rebel militia groups had already started to operate in other parts of the country. Now, at this point, the UN Commission on Human Rights and several other outside observers started monitoring the situation on the ground as Ba'athist troops and opposition militants started to do battle with one another. The first attempt at a ceasefire between the two groups happened between April and May of 2012. This was known as the Kofi Annan ceasefire attempt. Both the Syrian Arab Army and the Free Syrian Army violated this ceasefire on multiple occasions, resulting in dozens of casualties on both sides. The ceasefire is widely known as a failure, with Kofi Annan resigning as UN and Arab League Joint Special Envoy to Syria on August 2, 2012. He resigned out of pure frustration, as neighboring Arab nations such as Iran refused to step in and assist with the situation on the ground. At this point, the situation in Syria was still not classified as a fully fledged civil war. Before we go much further, we need to pause here and take a look at mid-2011. Up until this point, you probably noticed a trend. The Free Syrian Army was initially a group of rebel soldiers and police officers seeking to overthrow the Assad regime in order to put in place a democratic government for the people. This is a pretty easy initiative for the rest of the world to get behind. Now, knowing this, President Bashar al-Assad made the decision to release hundreds of Islamic militants from prison, knowing that the militants would likely assimilate themselves into the Free Syrian Army and begin radicalizing the FSA towards their own agendas. Now, it's likely that Assad made this move to give the rest of the world, who may interfere, two distinct choices. They could either accept his secular rule, or they could support the extremist jihadi alternative to him being in power. These extremists, once they were released from prison, began to form extremist factions within the Free Syrian Army, like Ahrar al-Sham, Liwa al-Tawhid, Ansar al-Sham, the Al-Nusra Front, Jaish al-Islam, and just so many others to track. In fact, the number of groups formed by these released prisoners is so large that we could probably make an entirely separate YouTube channel dedicated specifically to breaking down those factions and how they all interconnect and intertwine with each other. I mean, covering their beliefs, whose sides they fought on throughout the entire Civil War to date, there's just too much. There's too much to dive into there. This was an intentional move by the Assad regime to free these prisoners from confinement for an eventual assimilation into the Free Syrian Army. But I'm still always interested in what you think. Before we move forward, jump down into the comments section and let me know. Was it intentional or was it not? In June of 2012, we enter what is known as the third phase of the Syrian civil war. After the failure of the Kofi Annan ceasefire, the fighting in Syria continued to escalate, with both sides of the conflict fighting for control of major cities. Eventually, the situation on the ground escalated to an internationally recognized, fully fledged civil war. From 2012 until January of 2014, for the most part, this was a regular civil war fought between the Assad regime's Syrian Arab Army and the People's Free Syrian Army. Now, this all changed, however, in January of 2014, when the Islamist groups started coming to power. Just as with any civil war, a power vacuum is created. In late 2013, the Islamic State was on the rise in Iraq, and their activities towards carving out their own Islamic caliphate ran across the Syrian border into the Free Syrian Army-controlled town of Azaz. ISIL quickly took control over that city from the Free Syrian Army, mounting tensions between the two groups, which would eventually boil over into a second front of the Syrian civil war as ISIL rushed into FSA-controlled territory in an attempt to fill the power vacuum created by the already 4-year-long running civil war. From here, the waters only continue to get more and more muddy with each gunfight that erupts in the country. In September of 2014, after almost a year of the Islamic State intervening in battles between the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Arab Army and the small rogue extremist factions, the United States stepped in to intervene and bring an end to the Islamic State in Syria. Using the considerable air power of the United States Air Force and the United States Navy, as well as a number of clandestine ground troops from the three-letter agencies, the U.S. Navy SEALs, Special Forces, et al. Operations were put in place with the Kurdish YPG to put the Islamic State on the back foot. Now, these operations would continue all the way to the complete defeat of the Islamic State until 2018, when President Trump announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. In that window of time, we saw a lot of battles erupting across the entire country, and lines and alliances were shifting on a near hourly basis. Now, keeping track of who worked with who, doing what, and when is absolutely impossible. Alliances were formed and broken between rebel factions overnight, with groups working with each other one day to fight the Islamic State, only to turn on one another the next morning to gain complete control of a contested territory. The same could be said in instances where the Assad regime tried to move troops into the contested territories. Temporary alliances would be made without the thought of extremist ideologies coming to the forefront of the battle lines until the regime troops were pushed back, at which time the groups began to squabble amongst themselves. This went on until about 2015, when Russia stepped in to assist the Assad regime at the request of Bashar al-Assad. Assad feared losing control of his country entirely due to the Islamic State, and at his request, Russia began to support regime forces with their air power. On top of that, An Iranian initiative began moving a large number of Hezbollah fighters into the region to train and assist the Syrian forces alongside Russian special operations teams. This had the entire world holding their breath as Russian aircraft and American aircraft were bombing up opposing targets in the same airspace, while simultaneously on the ground, both nations had special operations troops controlling the aircraft above while training and assisting opposite sides of the same war. Now, we're coming to the end of this video, but we've really only covered part one of what we intend to be a two-part deep dive in Syria. There's so many more elements to this conflict and civil war than we're able to cover in a 10 to 12 minute slot here. But we're doing our best to just keep things as simple as possible. That said, the world isn't simple. It's not black and white or 1 and 0. There's a gray area where the majority of conflicts and wars live. Now, in the next part of the Syria deep dive, though, we'll be diving further into the interaction on the ground between the U.S. and Russian forces and other major developments in Syria since 2015. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please tap on the subscribe, thumbs up, and bell buttons. I'm Ronnie. I appreciate you guys watching. We'll be back with another update to this video for part 2 of our Syria Funker News Network deep dive, and stay informed. Hey, don't forget about Conflict of Nations. It's a free online PvP strategy game for modern global warfare. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. Click on the link below for an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Click the link, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. I'm out of here.